coming up in this video, I'll show you how I paint Robb Stark from a Song of Ice and Fire miniature game. Hey everyone, welcome back to MiniJunkie. Pretty short intro this time, because I don't have a lot of prep to talk about here. The only thing I will say is, unlike a couple of the other units I've painted for Song of Ice and Fire, where I try to cut corners and go more quickly, when it comes to characters and leaders, both for this game and for other games, I do spend more time. Those videos will end up being a little longer most of the time, even though I've tried to keep it. You can probably hear my kid playing Overwatch. Robb Stark, let's get to it. Before we get started, here's a look at the finished miniature. So with this one I did do a Zenithal prime, so he's been primed black and then primed with a gray from above, sort of airbrushing downwards. I wanted him to have kind of a plum colored cloth on the inner robes, and I started with Screamer Pink and it was much too pink. So I used P3 Sanguine base, and it's kind of thin, so you have to go over it with multiple coats, but it did have the right color I was looking for this. Yeah, it's an odd color. I don't know why it's not more opaque when you apply it, but in the end it does create the color you're looking for, I think. For the cloak I wanted blue, but a very, very dark, rich blue. I went with Huldra blue from Scale 75 Fantasy range. I guess I would say it's close to like a Cantor blue in terms of being dark, and this definitely needed 2 or 3 thin coats. I kind of struggled with his quilted pants, like you can see on his raised leg. I started though with a base of Citadel XV88 brown, with the intention of coming back to that later and doing some washes to darken it. I'm kind of using the TV show as a guide for how I'm painting Robb Stark, so for him to have pretty dark brown hair, I start with a base of Rhinox hide on the hair. Very simple. I'm painting my Starks with fairly dark colored metallic armor, so I start out with a base coat of Boiler Black. It's a little thick out of the bottle, so you may want to thin that with a little bit of water, maybe on a wet palette. And I just apply that to all the larger plates and the chainmail. With the flesh, which is really just his face in this case, I tried Midland Flesh as the base coat, with the intention of coming back, maybe doing 2 coats. It really was going on quite thin though and patchy, and in the end I decided I was going to go with a more ruddy complexion, so later on I'm going to come back and base coat that with Bugman's Glow. There's that sepia ink coming out. I used that with a coat over the XV88 on the quilted pants to create shading and to darken it at the same time. And yeah, as I mentioned, I decided to do the face with Bugman's Glow, both to create a darker base coat to work from and because it covered better. Wasn't really feeling that Midland Flesh. To shade the cloak, pretty straightforward. I added black to the original Huldra blue that I was using and painted that into the recessed areas and the darkest areas of the cloak. Or cape, or whatever that is. There isn't a ton to say about that, but I'm going to leave the footage run for just a little bit so that if you're interested in seeing where I'm applying the shading, for beginners, maybe a cloak like this has a lot of folds that you may be curious about where to apply the shade. For the plum colored areas, I'm highlighting with Sanguine Highlight from P3. There isn't a lot of detail sculpted into there, so I kind of had to make my own ripples and waves in the cloth. To highlight the cloak, I used the Huldra blue and added a little bit of bone color, just like a dot of it. In fact, I think I show you here how little I'm using, and I use a wet palette to keep it thin and flowing well as I'm highlighting the cloak. I like to use bone when I'm creating a lighter shade for highlighting, because it'll brighten it without really changing the color very much, and a white can get either chalky or too bright too quickly. Potentially I could have just found another out of the bottle light shade to use, but I wasn't seeing anything in my paint rack, believe it or not, and decided to just work with the original and just mix in some of that bone. And so what I do is when I'm highlighting multiple layers, I'll just continue to add a little bit more of the bone color, a little bit more, and then when I get to like the point where I'm doing a fairly bright highlight, like you can see on screen here, where I'm sort of almost edge highlighting, I'll add more than I had been using of the bone to really brighten it up an extra couple of steps. I washed the metal areas, like all the Boiler Black, with Nuln oil from GW, And I did that with full knowledge that it's going to dull down the metallics to quite flat, because I knew I was going to come back later and highlight them back up again. If I was not going to be doing that, I would use more like a gloss Nuln Oil so that I wouldn't lose some of that shine of the metals. I washed his face with Reichland Flesh Shade from GW right out of the bottle and let that dry. The fur on his shoulders is tricky. Like I wanted to do like on the move or on the show. It's kind of like a Wolverine fur, so it's quite dark with lighter patches. Never gets super bright, I wouldn't say. So I decided I was going to do that using ink washes and whatnot. So as opposed to just starting with a dark brown. So I actually create an undercoat of Rucksack Tan, which is like a tan colored bone mix. If you can't find P3 paints, you can see it on screen and try to match it, maybe like a Baylor brown. Once that's dry, I gave it a all over wash of straight sepia ink from Vallejo. It's going to be shiny, but later on we're going to use matte varnish anyway, and it's going to be quite dark. It's going to tint the color of the Rucksack Tan, but overall it's going to create a feeling of dark fur that has lighter tones to it. I don't know how to describe it. You can see it. I think in part the pants, I had probably removed a little bit of the quilting detail when I cleaned out the mold lines. That's just kind of the way it is with this type of figure, which is a PVC plastic figure, I believe. But I took XV88 and highlighted tried to draw in the quilted square areas of his leather armor. His boots were painted with GW Doom Bull Brown. And here you see I'm coming back again with the sepia ink to do another coat and continue to darken it while retaining the lighter raised areas of the fur. Obviously you wait till the first coat is completely dried. And then I applied it over his pants because I wasn't feeling good about his pants, and I don't think I ever got to a place where I was completely satisfied with them. I did a first highlight of the hair over the Rhinox hide with Dryad bark, but I feel like it doesn't even show. So you could maybe skip this step and just do the other steps with the hair that you'll see in a bit. I guess now I found a use for that bright Screamer pink and used it as a final highlight on the plum colored armor coat thing he wears. It's hard to describe this guy's armor. Then I take Vallejo black ink out of the bottle and paint it over the boots. So maybe I didn't actually paint the boots Doom Bull Brown before. Or I didn't like how they looked, and so I just decided to cover them with the black. Very strange. Sorry about that. Here's where I think the hair highlight starts to show up. So I take Dryad bark and Tau ochre and about 50-50, and just very, very lightly start to sketch in the hair. You're not really painting individual hairs, but you're painting like the areas that you can see it on the screen. For the coat trim, I decided like a purpley blue would look nice. So I used the Fang and just paint that over the trim, just like you can see in the video. Then I painted on some highlights with Fenrisian Gray. Kind of more like edge highlighting, but I did kind of sketch in some of the areas that would be hit by more light on the trim. Any sort of straps that were showing or his belt, I used XV88 to get like a leather color. I guess I was determined to use Doom Bull Brown on this guy, and so I base coated his gloves with that. Now the Wolverine fur does have lighter patches in it, so I took Xandri Dust and did a light dry brush. Probably a little bit more than I should have, but that's what I used for this next step, and obviously you want to wait till that sepia ink is dried. Followed by a dry brush of Ushabti Bone, just very lightly on the over top of the Xandri Dust portions. And this ended up looking a little messy, I think. And so I do come back later. We're going to give that a bit of a glaze to kind of bring it down a bit. It's too bright. Gave his gloves a wash/glaze of brown ink from Vallejo Game Ink. Feels like I'm struggling for words today. I didn't know what the heck that thing was on the side, and I finally realized it was sort of like a fur purse bag thing. So I painted gray. I start out with a base coat of Dawnstone Gray. So yeah, just to tint down the brighter spots of the fur that I wasn't super happy with, I took straight Citadel Seraphim Sepia and just glazed that over. It's going to not horribly change the color, but it will bring it down from being too bright and blend it together a bit. The gloves were highlighted with Scrag Brown to pull out some of that detail on the fingers, etc. I washed the purse with Citadel Null Oil shade to give it a little bit of shading and detail. Once I was dry, it couldn't really be dry brushed. The detail wasn't sort of crisp enough, but I just took some Dawnstone and sort of worked in some of the fur effect, and then I followed that up with Administratum Gray and highlighted it a little bit more. Now for the face, I took Bugman's Glow again, thinned it, and then started to work in highlights. Because the Reichland Flesh Shade will have darkened the overall Bugman's Glow of the first coat. So we're working on forehead, nose, cheekbones, chin. Here I'm adding some more Tau Light Ochre to the original mix, which was the Dryad Bark and Tau Light Ochre. I'm using that to highlight more towards the top of the head and the center part of his hair. Decided to do a little black lining to bring out some of the areas of detail, create some separation, but bear in mind black lining or dark lining doesn't always have to be black, because I've often used black ink. In this case though, I decided that'd be a little too stark, but a dark brown would work, so I took the sepia, which is actually quite a dark brown when it's concentrated, and I just sort of drew in shading underneath belts and underneath pouches and between the trim and the coat and things like that. I used chainmail to highlight the armor. You could use a Runefang steel. I also drew that down the edge of the blade because I wanted to create a sharper looking blade. Not much more to explain about that. This was followed up with mithril silver, just on the very edges of things like the blade, edges of armor plates. You're just using that to pick out the sharpest, brightest points. You can use a Stormhost silver, for example, or any other bright silver you have. The Starks aren't really blingy guys, so I used a little bit of elf gold that's dwarven gold from scale 75, just for the hilt of his sword. That was then highlighted with just a little bit of Radiant Platinum from P3 added to it. Back to the face. On the wet palette, I'm going to be using a little bit of Bugman's Glow and be adding a drop or so of Cadian Flesh Tone for each highlight, and I'm going to add a little more Cadian Flesh Tone for each subsequent highlight and work on smaller and smaller areas of the face as I do that. The highlight, of course, on a face is where this sort of picture a light shining down, hitting the forehead, the eyebrows, ridges, the bridge of your nose, the tip of your nose, the cheekbones, and yeah, I'm just showing you Cadian Flesh Tone because I'm continuing to add more. The sort of end of your chin, and you're just trying to create that light effect and create a shading and a shadow under the cheekbones and in the recessed areas. This is another spot where I'll leave the footage running even though I don't have a lot more to say, just so you can see how I'm applying it. Alright, I'm back and I'm using Kislev Flesh now, and I'm adding that to the mix we've been working with just to create a couple of final extra bright highlights. So right at the top of the hairline, the end of the nose, etc., just to really brighten up. The face is the focal point of the Mini, so you do want it to be fairly bright and eye-catching. And here's the finished model. I will say that this type of miniature, like I said, it's PVC. It's a bit of a softer plastic. They use harder plastic for the weapons so they don't warp, which is great. But you do get, I think, less crisp detail to work with as you're painting. So that's my excuse for why this doesn't look as amazing as it could probably. You want more like a resin or a metal or high whatever plastic on sprues is where you'll get sharper details. But I actually really like this stuff for the Song of Ice and Fire game. I think it did turn out nice looking. I'm looking forward to painting more of them. So despite what I just said, I am quite happy with these miniatures. I think they're great. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hoping to get more videos flowing soon. Until next time, thanks.